Welcome back, and we're moving into our first conversation this morning. We're joined by Senator Valerie Woods, senator representing the opposition, and we're talking once again about the amendment to the Drug Use Act, and we're talking about the politics and business of marijuana. Good morning, and welcome.
Good morning, Sunny. Morning, Marlene.
So, Senator Woods, we know that you have joined what I would say is the minority on this issue in terms of disagreeing and in fact voting against in the Senate the passing of the amendment to allow for the decriminalization of marijuana. And I want to just give you the opportunity immediately to be able to explain to us why or what made you come to this decision.
All right. First, let me clarify, because as I said in the Senate, when I prefaced my contribution on this debate, is I fully support decriminalizing of marijuana. I think it should have been done, quite frankly, a long time ago. It is completely an imbalance that we have, where we know members of society, north, south, east, and west, are probably dabbling in their personal use of marijuana, but it's not these persons that we're seeing hauled off on the streets, on their cameras, by police, on a bike, and so forth. So decriminalizing, which specifically means you will not have a criminal record for a small amount, and that it will not be something that will disenfranchise your future opportunities because of that small amount. I am in support of that. What I had difficulty with is supporting a bill that does more than that without any regulation and any consideration for the regulatory framework to make it a common sense bill. Understand also, Isani and Marlene, that this bill was also debated on the same day that we had the government and its government senators try to convince everybody that they didn't borrow $60 million before for the same thing that they came to us now for $12 million US for the Haulover Bridge. So it comes in an environment where the transparency, the accountability, and good governance, the lack of these things rears its ugly head in front of you. And then you try and come and camouflage what ought to have been a good bill to decriminalize, but you're under the guise of it, you are actually legalizing, although in a limited fashion, to a certain in a certain respect, but in a full fashion when it comes to hemp, without any regulations, without any clear communication to the public that this is your intent. I have difficulty with that. Had they presented a decriminalizing bill alone, I would fully support it.
Now, your statement, I think, is one that we have to expand on, because when you say you would support a decriminalization bill, the public understands that what is being brought forth by the government at this time and what has been signed by the Governor General is a decriminalization bill. How do you distinguish between
because
what is being...
it's more than that.
Okay.
If you look at the Jamaica, and I believe you had the
Jamaican
Foreign
Foreign
Affairs Minister for Jamaica, and she was quite articulate and quite clear. They too decriminalized possession, and also, she was very clear on it, and they also now have made the pathway to legalization, and she explained how. When this bill was introduced to the country in August, it was never about decriminalizing possession, and now, with additional amendments, we're now creating the pathway. This is what we have done. Let me be clear. I do not have an issue either if you're going in that direction. I have an issue with the gross level of irresponsibility being applied to changing an illegal substance to a legal substance. We are now past decrim. There are some issues with the decriminalization aspect of it where I've heard some lawyers have spoken to that, and it's common sense, but that uncertainty occurs when you rush bills through. One of the things that I have in my brief time at the Senate, Marlene and Isani, that I try to underscore, regardless of who has placed you there, be it the government, the churches, the business, the unions, or the opposition. As a senator, your ultimate responsibility is to review bills and legislation, but from the perspective of improving it if it needs improvement and ensuring that it is for the good of the public. What sense does it make for me as a senator to look at something knowing that it is filled with uncertainties, leaves far more questions than answers, but I will just blindly go ahead and say, oh yes, let's go ahead because it's the popular thing and we all want to decriminalize it, even though we know we're doing a little bit more than that, and I'll expand on that. If we took that approach, then we shouldn't have an issue with $60 million being approved less than 3 years ago for a bridge and coming back again for $12 million without any explanation or any accountability. That's not what the people out there are fed up of. They're fed up of the fact that this is a rubber stamp process and nobody is taking the time to do it properly. And I don't, on the heels of a Senate or within a Senate meeting, that we had the most ridiculous attempts to try and convince the people that they weren't approving monies twice for the same bridge. We're now going to wholesale approve something when we didn't have to. We could have still done decriminalization and insist that the regulatory framework comes back to us to talk about the hemp, the medical marijuana, as well as the limited recreational use.
Let me approach from a different perspective here then, because I get the impression that to a great extent this is a trial and error phase that we're going through in terms of this whole marijuana issue and its decriminalization. I say that because on Friday the issue of how do we treat this situation if it involves minors in possession of marijuana? The same way we wouldn't be allowed to sell or vend alcohol or cigarettes to minors below the age of 18. What happens if a minor is found in possession of 10 grams of marijuana? The AG went to great extent explaining, okay, well, that individual will be placed through a counseling process and he will be dealt with accordingly because it's still an infraction. But I don't get the impression that something, a system or a mechanism has already been
that's
formalized.
the issue.
And then now that the thing is decriminalized, you can now begin rolling it out.
Yeah,
I don't know that we're there yet.
That's the issue. And if you speak to teachers and principals across this country, it's not that they haven't dealt with that, Isani. They themselves have a system in place. What is needed, as I believe a couple of the senators in that Senate meeting stated, where is the in tandem commitment by the government to provide the resources for those counseling sessions, if you will? My position on this was focused primarily on the other amendments because I support decriminalizing. Will there be some hiccups on that? I am sure. There's a thing there that talks about there's a clause there that talks about you'll be given a verbal warning. How is that going to be monitored? If I'm the cop A that catches you, and then cop B catches you 2 weeks later, is it still a verbal warning? Or so
will there be some sort of system? I think that's one of the questions we haven't heard answered as well.
One of the things that I looked to was Jamaica's law. And why not look at Jamaica's law? It is only the country, the island state in the Caribbean, that is equated with, or synonymous with, if you will, that of the marijuana or cannabis industry. And so I would look to them to see how did they tackle this? Because they're no different than us in the sense that they're dealing with the same issues, whether it be religious, social, economic, their commitments internationally on whatever conventions regarding drugs and so forth. What they did was very responsible. So they actually decriminalized to a larger amount. I think theirs is 56 or thereabouts grams, just under 2 ounces, if I'm not mistaken.
It's 2 ounces as far as the foreign minister had mentioned.
So they decriminalized that, meaning no criminal record. Fantastic. Then when it comes to the limited legalization, hemp and medical marijuana, they are very clear. They have a cannabis licensing authority. It deals with licensing, permitting for cultivating, none of that. It's all silent in our legislation. They also deal with the limited use, if you will, recreation, religious, or spiritual, because of their healthy Rastafarian community. Yes, but you are allowed 5 plants in your household per adult, right? 5 plants in your household. And if it's for the spiritual, it has to be at your place of registered religious practice, if you will. They went further and made it clear that don't be under any illusion that you can now export this. Don't be under any illusion that it is still legal, because it is not. What they are doing is regulating some of the amendments, regulating, not just putting the amendments, but regulating how to do it in a proper, responsible way, so as 1, consider the societal impacts, 2, the economic impacts, which should be big, and 3, considering their place in global context as it relates to their conventions that they have signed to.
Now let me ask you this. There has been, in my opinion, sufficient time in terms of being able to fully discuss and look at different approaches in which to roll out this particular
None of which
amendment.
the government, none of the government mouthpieces in the Senate, not one of them cited them.
Okay, now I recall Doug Singh as the chairman of the Marijuana Decriminalization Committee several years ago. And this group was tasked with specifically that, to lay the groundwork, so have the dialogue and have people buy in.
To look at the pros and cons.
Exactly.
Yes.
And what I get now is that perhaps it doesn't have all of these features that lend to public knowledge and
Have you
awareness
read
of
the
what's
report?
happening.
It's a 2015, the Committee for the Decriminalization of Marijuana report in 2015. It's an interesting read because it does have a lot of information. Its conclusions and its recommendation was specific to decriminalization. It wasn't about hemp. It wasn't about medical marijuana. Within the report, it recognizes through surveys and some research that it has looked at that these are areas of possible opportunity or the way that the trend is going. But its recommendation, it kept to its focus, decriminalization. It is an essential first step to the pathway of legalization. We got to get that right. Now we're going into hemp and medical marijuana. My question is very simple. I'm a patient that the only thing that has been determined by all doctors I've checked is marijuana for whatever illness I may have. How am I going to get it if I can't grow it, if I can't buy it? That makes no sense.
In other words, you have to commit an illegal act to have a legal quantity of marijuana. I want to.
Cart and the horse.
I think these are.
We have examples of where it can be done properly.
And to be clear, I know we've had so many different conversations about this issue from the medical perspective. We had a forensic toxicologist, we've had a pharmacist, we've had recreational users. I think there's so many different aspects that oftentimes people can get confused as to what the pros and cons really are. If you're using already, it's obviously clear, it's fine. I can now be able to smoke it in my house and I won't have a problem. But let's try to dissect where some of your concerns come from.
Can I just say this though, Marlene? You're having all of that questions and different perspectives because we did more than what we set out to do. We went beyond decriminalizing, and you cannot, you really can't fault people for having all of the concerns and questions because the bill is lousy. It is sloppily written. It provides a lot of uncertainties and questions. And when you have, as you did on an interview Friday with the Attorney General, the response from a government representative saying, yeah, we know it's imperfect, but hey, man, it's like baby steps. No, your baby step was decriminalizing. You have purposely put a society within an environment of the unknown. And that is irresponsible.
And there was time since
of course.
the committee was formed to
Yes.
now. But let's look at the hemp issue, because to be able to separate what we're talking about, there's the decriminalization of the 10 grams or less for recreational use. There's a medical marijuana, and there's also the hemp. And I've heard and read of your specific recommendations and concerns when it comes to the hemp industry. So let's take a moment to go into that.
Yes, because that's where you have to follow the money now. We're talking business here.
These are what are seen as some of the economic benefits of marijuana.
Hemp, and so too is medical, depending on how you would license that aspect and the permit to grow and so forth. In Jamaica's law, for example, they limit the amount of acreage for the cultivation. So this is business, all right? The decriminalizing, that's not business. So I, like I said, there are areas there that still would need to be cleaned up. I know other senators mentioned the commitment to the counseling and all of this, which was very important. I paid attention to the business aspect of this thing, because that's where unequal opportunity can set in, and more than likely will set in when there's no regulation.
Senator, I'm glad that you raised that point, simply because it is a discussion that is being had amongst a lot of people across society, but it has never really been something that is addressed at the forefront. If we were to ever move into a scenario where it is legal, it becomes legal.
Hemp is legal. Okay. That's what this bill did.
But like you said, you have to have a grower, you have to have someone who is going to wholesale and retail it.
Yes.
Right? People are skeptical that this, you'll forgive the perspective. People are skeptical because in the political climate and environment that we live in, everything seems to be drawn, all the decisions are drawn along those lines, so that, for instance, cronyism doesn't fall far from that.
There's no need to ask for forgiveness. I make no bones about what I wrote, okay? I have an issue by creating an entirely new industry under the guise of decriminalization without any proper regulation, because it lends itself to friends of government, cronies of government benefiting. So while the man on the bicycle or in the yard or in the empty lot will get 10 grams and hey, we are getting on slap on the wrist and no worry, big business that happened with the other strain of cannabis. That is my concern. We need new industries, don't get me wrong.
And you're echoing the concerns of a lot of people, by the way.
But it's a valid concern. Jamaica, I go back to them and I will use them as an example. I'm not saying they have the perfect, but they took the time to do it as right as you can within the context of the environment that they have. They, by the way, just issued their first 2 licenses in October of this year. Their law was passed in 2015 with the regulation, and they just issued, just to give you the careful attention that they gave to make sure that this was done responsibly.
And there's compliance in terms of those applying for the
There's an
license.
authority, and they made sure if Marlene is given the permit to cultivate, she's not given the permit to process and sell. That's a different. And the reason for that is to try and create a playing field, a level playing field, but not to abuse it. Why is that important? Hemp, to the amateur eye, looks very much like cannabis, like the cannabis that we all know for the recreational aspect. You got to make sure that it's really hemp that's being grown. So it's so important that we look at that. That's one. 2, the business aspect of it. Are we now opening ourselves without the proper regulation to just having a few selected people, connected people benefit?
And that is the concern.
Even when it comes to the hemp, I know there is a prescription to be made in terms of the amount of
which
THC,
they haven't prescribed,
which is a very technical process as well. And I can recall from the conversations that we've had with representatives of the medical field, looking at the different forms of cannabis, which ones possess more THC, which ones would have more effects on a person's psychological well-being over time. and being able to make these distinctions. But those are distinctions that I don't necessarily see in the amendment. The mention of the THC comes under the issue with the industrial hemp.
TCH, right?
Yeah. Sorry, thank you. It comes under the explanation for the industrial hemp.
Yes.
And so it seems that even in the thought as to what will be allowed in people's homes, there hasn't been any distinction made there as yet.
No, and there hasn't been any prescription of what that level of TCH will be under the hemp either. Let me reiterate. The bill has provided, the law, because it's now law, has provided a pathway to legalization, but it has done so in a most irresponsible way. And in a country that lacks transparency, accountability, good governance, compliance to law, enforcement, monitoring that you can trust, we should be concerned about that. From the perspective of exploitation or abuse, if you will, of the substance, but I'm also saying from the business that will be made and the money that will be made. This country desperately needs new industries. There is no doubt about it. But is this going to get us the way it's sloppily done? Is this going to get us to a level playing field where, yeah, you up on the street, you the guy on the bike, or the woman on the bike, where they get pulled over and you just get, hey, remember, for do this, that they'll leave verbal warning. Is that the extent of where you will benefit, or are you going to benefit by now making money as well?
Senator, can now be a situation that perhaps the law or the amendment was made, and now there is a process taking place in terms of being able to formulate the regulatory bodies and some of perhaps the restrictions that they would like to see in some of the industries that may come out of it? Are you satisfied with perhaps that as an explanation?
No, because I've lived under 9 years of this government providing similar explanations, and we don't see it yet. I would have, as I have suggested in what I have written, there needs to be, with post-haste urgency, there needs to be a bipartisan committee, and with others, not just the members of the government and the members of the opposition, but we need to, with haste, establish a committee to look at the regulations needed to put some sense into the nonsense that exists in the bill. The law has passed. Now let's try as best as we can, which is not the way it should have been done, but it is what it is. I hate to use the term, but that is how they're running the government. And now let's get some logic back into this thing to erase or minimize the amount of questions and uncertainties. Let me tell you this also, on just the decriminalization aspect. A question was raised in the Senate by my colleague, Senator Thompson, about expunging of your record. And the response given was limited to, if I recall correctly, on a level of fine that you were charged. But what if you had imprisonment? What if you had a term in jail?
Yeah.
How do you, that wasn't addressed, and it's not addressed in there. On the educational institutions, for example, the section of the amendment that goes to great detail to describe what those are, and that whether it's on the basketball court, the football field, what have you, anywhere within that defines that compound, the student would be asked to, as long as you're under 18, right? The student would be asked to do counseling, I believe, or put in a program. What about the faculty? It doesn't talk about the faculty on the educational institution. So there's a lot of little gray areas in this bill that, beyond decriminalization, even within decriminalization, needs some regulations to be fleshed out properly. So that's my take on it. We can continue to operate the way we are and just go with the flow because, whoa, somehow some of us can get high and it's okay up to 10 grams and we're all happy about it. Or we can be the responsible leaders that we were asked to be in the Senate and say, listen, let's do this, but let's send it back where we're okay with decriminalization, but let's put more thought into these other areas.
Let me ask you a question quickly. As a senator, the fact that the church has seemingly come out fairly late in respect of this issue, what are your thoughts when you heard the position taken by NIAB, for instance, where it has now come out and said, you know what, we are collectively, as an evangelical association, against the passage of this bill into law? What were your initial thoughts, seeing as though it seemed to have been practice after race, in a sense?
I'm not so sure if I was surprised. I mean, it's the church. I was surprised. I actually thought I was probably going to be the only one dissenting because the history of the representative hasn't been one that necessarily goes against government, if you will. But and the church has its reasons why it would not support this. I would love to have seen similar a similar effort on the Hollover Bridge issue, which occurred on the same day, because no, it's not a drug, but you are, let's face it, you are disenfranchising thousands and thousands and thousands of Belizeans when you mismanage public funds and you have nothing to say about it. In fact, you go to the extent of saying you're pleased with the administration. So when that vote came up, quite frankly, or not that vote because it didn't go to a vote, but when the comments came up where the church representative said they don't support it, it's neither here nor there for me. I would have liked for them to have said it much earlier, but with equal measure and vigor, there are many other things that needs to have that support of we will no longer tolerate lack of transparency, lack of accountability, lack of good governance. So it's unfortunate, notwithstanding all of that, that the Attorney General was so vile in his remarks towards the church. I don't think we need to do that. I think one has to respect other views. I think we could do it in a more honorable way, if we're going to use the title honorable, before names. And this response, and I'm paraphrasing here, but what I gathered from the interview, and I'm not surprised because he has said it as much to us in the Senate, if you want to change it, put your name on a ballot. If we're going to make change in this country, it can't just be that the only position you have or the only way you can do it is by running electorally. You know, voices matter, people's concern matter, and you should not be dictating, because that's an act of dictating to us that if you want to change what we do, get in, win, and undo the laws that we do. No, there is real opportunity for bipartisan support and multi-partisan collaboration. There rarely is, but not everything needs to be the hardcore popular politics that it's turning out to be.
That requires a certain vision and a certain maturity, though, because again, going back to the political climate, I mean, when one party is in, that party is the party that spearheads everything. It doesn't really consult, it doesn't really take into consideration other concerns from elsewhere within society. It's just, it's UDP, it's UDP. It's PUP, it's PUP. There's hardly ever that, you know what, let's put the politics of it aside, the partisan aspect of it, and come together and solve an issue or address an issue the way it ought to be.
Yeah, and we have to keep chipping away at that. I know that the leader of the opposition, he's made his position quite clear in the House a long time ago, that if we're going to do this, it should be done properly. Let's do the proper research regarding legalization, where we can go, and so forth. He's also made his position clear on areas for bipartisanship. It has really not been taken up by the government. When the People's United Party gets into government, that will be the test to see if those words will be translated into action. That is how democracy works. I certainly want to build the view that because of where the party has come and its history, those of us who support the People's United Party have more at stake not to do it the right way. We will lose more if we don't do it the more responsible way. So I think that we have come a long way, those of us who support the party, to work with members in the party and to work towards doing things differently. You know, there was an opportunity. It's not lost either, by the way. We can still fix the gaps in this thing if we're serious. And that, but unfortunately, that will have to come with from the government side, unfortunately. We had an opportunity at the Senate, prior to the Senate, and even now after the Senate meeting, to get the regulations done properly. Not for the interest of any one party, because I do think on this case, this issue, where you're taking illegality of something to a form of legality, should be apolitical. That it shouldn't, and it is a very popular move, but you know, once you go from contesting an election to then forming the government, you gotta govern. And I think if we don't correct this, we're doing a disservice to the people.
Now, I think, you know, to be fair, in terms of understanding the role of the Senate, we also were joined last week by Senator Mark Lizarraga, who, representing the business sector, also expressed his concerns.
Yes,
and
they had detailed concerns.
And his support, and he was very clear in saying yes and no, for the simple fact that, similar to your position, there are merits to being able to make this move, but at the same time, there are crucial areas that have to be addressed. His concern had more to do with the exposure of children and youths to the use of marijuana, where it has been shown that it can have negative effects on their brain development. What are your thoughts on this issue?
I liken it to that of smoking. I liken that to alcohol, and we have clear regulations on those. We have when minors are caught drinking, or when a business establishment is caught selling, there's a regulatory framework for handling that. Like I said, schools are not shy in letting you know how they've been dealing with this issue, because they are dealing with it. What I would have wanted to see is that the schools and the teaching system in Belize would have gotten a lot more support out of an amendment like this in helping to deal with that. They got none, because there is no commitment by government to step up the resources there. Interestingly enough, in the report, the final report 2015 of the Decrim Committee, the National Drug NDAC, the Drug Council, which is a government agency, sounded their concerns loud and clear, even made recommendations. None of it ended up in the amendment. They have critical concerns. You would have thought that making such a progressive move would have considered some of those concerns. It's not that they were stopping it. They just made some very practical observations, recommendations from the perspective of youth and what this will now mean. They even recommended, I believe it's like a time period, which I think is another responsible thing to do. But obviously, I'm not going to be naive here. There's elections looming. You got to do what's popular to try and get people on your side when you've botched it up.
How much of it is political mileage being sought?
Yeah, that's where they, and that will happen, but you have to balance that. My point, I could have voted the yes and no way, but I chose not to. I chose not to because we keep doing that, and that is what's wrong with our system. We could have gone with yes to decriminalization, made the amendments to these amendments to ensure that it's just that. Have that Decrim committee, if you will, be re-engaged again, reactivated to get the regulations going for the hemp, the medical marijuana, and the limited recreational use.
What would you identify as, having said all that we've said, and this is in fact now law, what would you say needs to be the priority action in terms of filling a gap, or the gap that exists, and now that the decriminalization amendment has been put through?
A group bipartisan, as well, it really ought to be multi-partisan.
Yes. Well, medical representatives
Yes,
would need to be
which
on,
is why multi,
Yeah.
not just the members of the government and the opposition. Post with urgency, have a committee going to now establish regulations to get this law properly implemented, monitored, regulated. There are examples to the extreme, by the way, to the far right and to the far left of this issue. There's no need for us to go and just to do any one of those, but to look at the examples out there within the context of Belize and put some rational thinking behind it. Election will come and go, but this law will be here. And so we owe it, not to ourselves, quite frankly, but to the very youth that we're concerned about, to make sure that we do this the right way. A law ought to give you clarity. It should not give you uncertainty. And this is what this law has done.
Now, what was also interesting of your position within the Senate was obviously in the House of Representatives, the amendment enjoyed bipartisan support. In terms of your role within the People's United Party in having this particular view, has there been support for you taking this particular position?
There hasn't been any, if you will, backlash coming out of it. The People's United Party, I think, has changed so much where it is encouraging so many interesting views and communication and debate prior to any one meeting that we have for Senate or the House. When at one of our meetings, I did say that I'm all for decriminalization. At what point did government change this into something else than that? I said, this is crazy.
It mutated overnight.
Like many things. So, but Marlene, specifically to your point, I've always stated publicly that I'm appointed by the opposition, and I serve at the pleasure of that appointment and of the leader of the opposition. And if at any time there is discontent that, you know, we may need a change, this is not working out, I'm okay with that. But I will not, to the best of my ability, I will not be party to something that I think could have been done better and still meet the same result. I will not do it. And thankfully, to date, the leader of the opposition who appointed me respects my views, and I appreciate that.
Okay. Anything else you would like to say? I'm sure, you know, in this message, people may only hear that you did not support the amendment.
Yes, that's the society we live in. And I've had all sorts of texts and emails sent to me about, not by members of the party or the leadership of the party, but by, you know, the general public, that, just, I'll use the Attorney General's word, just shut up and come on, it's decrim, let's just get this going on. That's one view. I cannot correct that on my own. I can't do anything about that. People are entitled to their opinions. But I will say this, you cannot ask for responsible government and your senators to think properly, responsibly, and independently, and then criticize the senator who is saying, hey, wait a minute, this is going too fast. Can we just decrim, and by all means, let's get the committee going to put in the regulations for the pathway to legalization. So I get those emails and texts. That's fine, it's democracy. I think without any hesitation, there ought to be a convening of a committee, of a group of people to get regulations going. If we really want the pathway to legalization, let's do it properly. I'm all for that.
Okay. Thank you very much for being with us this morning and sharing your perspective.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
All right. We're going to go ahead and take a break, and when we come back, we'll be joined by representatives of the Community Policing Department of the Police Department. Stay tuned.